Okay, so General Conference already feels like a year away now because we've just had annual conference this week, which is our own local geographic area. But I thought it would be maybe helpful to offer sort of some reflections on General Conference and to answer any questions, mostly to answer any questions anybody has about it. So is everybody in the room familiar with what General Conference is? What does that mean when I say General Conference? Yes? No. That's okay. So we'll do a refresher for everybody. So the United Methodist Church is organized. We're not called Methodists for nothing. So the American church is organized like the American government. We have 3 branches of our church denomination. One of them is the executive branch. That's our Council of Bishops. One of them is the judicial branch, which is our judicial council, which functions in the same way as the Supreme Court. And we have our legislative branch, which is called General Conference. So General Conference meets quadrennially every 4 years, in this case 8. Because of COVID, we were scheduled for a General Conference, usually in the same year as presidential elections, coincidentally. So we did not have one in 2020, so we just had our 2020 postponed General Conference in 2024. This is where, you need to turn that down, Mark. Thank you. This is where we revise and add, take away, change our book of discipline, which is our polity document, it's our governance document, it's all the rules we live by as United Methodists. Okay, so we meet every 4 years, we meet for 2 weeks with up to 1,000 delegates from the worldwide church. We are apportioned delegates according to the membership in our annual conferences. In our case, Upper New York is our annual conference. So we're organized General Conference, jurisdictional and central conferences, and then annual conferences, and then districts. So we're organized to the nth degree, more granularly as we go down in size. Members to General Conference are decided based on how many members are in your annual conference. So we had 10 delegates, equal number of lay and clergy delegates based on the membership of Upper New York annual conference. Other conferences had a lot more. Many had a lot less. Like New England annual conference, which covers, as you might expect, New England, had 3 clergy and 3 lay delegates. We had 5 clergy and 5 lay. So anyway, so all those delegates up to 1,000, and that's a cap, attend General Conference. This year we had 760 something present. We had delegates who could not get there because of visa issues. That's always the case. Anyway, so you meet for 2 weeks. The first week is what we call, Nate, can you turn that down just a little? It's ringing every time I say something. So, better. We meet for 2 weeks. The first week is legislative sections. Anybody can submit a petition or a resolution to General Conference. Anybody in the whole wide world in the United Methodist Church can submit legislation. So Ron Platt of Central United Methodist Church in Endicott, New York, could write a piece of legislation for General Conference to consider, and if it's not out of order, if it's not, doesn't break any rules or anything like that, General Conference considers it. So we had upward of 1,000 petitions this year from individual people, boards, agencies, bishops. We had all sorts of legislation to consider, about 1,000 pieces. We had a good, dozens of pieces that had been submitted by people who then later withdrew and disaffiliated to become either Global Methodists or something else, so we didn't consider those. The first week, we break all that legislation down into subject matter. Well, the General Conference Commission on Petitions and Resolutions breaks it down by subject. And you meet in these sections, legislative sections, to address this particular subject matter. My area was ordination. My legislative section considered matters of ordination. This year, that was a big deal because there was legislation there changing the nature of local pastor licensing. Paul is a licensed local pastor. There was legislation about sacramental rights for deacons, ordained deacons. That's a whole other story that I can answer that question if anybody's remotely interested. So there are about 12 legislative sections addressing all those petitions. When you consider a petition in a legislative section, if it's either voted up or down, yes or no, with less than 20% opposition, or 20% or 20 people, I can't remember if it's 20% or 20 people, opposition, it goes on the consent, what we call a consent calendar. So that means that each legislative section may completely agree with 10 pieces of legislation. That can go on a consent calendar. When it comes before the plenary body the next week, we can say we adopt the consent calendar as a whole, unless someone pulls something off. Is that making sense? Okay. So many times a legislative section will send half of its stuff through on a consent calendar. They agree, they don't agree, up or down. What's left, you parse, and people will amend the amendments, or do all sorts of legislative stuff. What was very different about this General Conference, because of all the disaffiliations of the most conservative folks in our denomination, what was different is that the use of amending and legislative procedures to stymie and block the work of legislative committees did not happen this year. It has happened for years and years and years. Many of the far right in our denomination were very politically savvy and Alice can tell you this, she served on, yeah. Right. So the use of legal and political tactics to either keep stuff off a consent calendar or to make sure it got on, that sort of work wasn't being done this year to the same degree. So that was a relief. Legislative sections were finding that centrist and progressive leaning legislation was passing by 80 and 90% margins, as opposed to really close votes we'd had before. So that was kind of a relief. We all went in sort of armed for, braced for the fight, for problems. And those first votes started happening in those legislative sections, and in mine they were 90%, 93%, 96%. It was just, became very clear very quickly that this was going to be a whole different thing, yeah. The far right wasn't there, yeah. Many clergy and churches disaffiliated under the provisions of the paragraph that ran out at the end of 2023. What we had been told, and what happened to some extent, was that there were clergy who were waiting to disaffiliate, clergy who had been elected to General Conference, who were waiting to disaffiliate until after General Conference so that they could still, well, as many of us said, try to burn the house down on their way out. That did not seem to be as true as we thought it was going to be, and as we had sort of braced for. There were still many delegates. We had 2 delegates in our delegation. And one of them, it would have been nice if he'd explained this at the beginning, but he was elected by conservative members of our conference to represent them. We don't represent, we're delegated by, but, he was elected, and he felt he had to honor their election of him. So he went. He was a reserve delegate. He did not see any time on the floor. But, you know, I got to admire his commitment to honoring that election. So the first week we spend in that legislative section all day long. And then the next week, the second week, is the plenary, where we all meet together in one big room. The consent calendars have been formed. There is a chance for anyone who can garner 20 signatures to remove something from a consent calendar. In other words, I don't want this to pass on an up or down vote. I want to talk about this piece of legislation. And the legislative section put it through on a consent calendar, but I feel like General Conference needs to talk about this. So you can withdraw something, pull something from the consent calendar, and with the proper number of signatures behind you, and we have to address it. There was not a lot of that this year. Very often, a lot of those things have come off consent calendars because people either want to change that legislation substantially, kill it dead by hamstringing it with lots of different amendments, or want the chance to make their speeches about it. That wasn't as true this year. There were some pieces pulled, but not many. So I tell you all of that to tell you that there were three main foci of the centrist and progressive coalitions for this General Conference. And let me just say, the first marvel is that the centrists and the progressives formed a coalition. Progressives are notoriously terrible at organizing. We're awful at it because we all have our own pet project, right, that we want to get passed, that we all want to have happen. And we tend to fall apart at the seams when we try to organize. But I think with the delay COVID provided, and with the use of Zoom and the use of lots of electronic team building and things like that, the progressives and the centrists formed effective coalitions this year. That was another change. So the three foci of the progressive and centrist coalition, I'm just going to say coalition from now on because I don't want to keep saying that. The coalition, our coalition, were regionalization, revising of the social principles, and removing the harmful language in the discipline. And I'll cover each one of those. But regionalization, remember how I said we were organized? Really, really organized? We have a polity that looks global, that has looked global. We have jurisdictional conferences in the United States, which are regions, like we're in the Northeast jurisdiction. I'll have that conference in second week of July. That is, there are 10 annual conferences in our jurisdiction. And so there are 5 jurisdictions in the United States. And the same kind of organization is in other parts of the world called a central conference. So like the Philippines have central conferences, and the conferences in Africa are central conferences. And in Europe as well. So they're the same kind of geographical arrangement, but our discipline is U.S.-centric, very U.S.-centric. I mean, we always have General Conference in the U.S. That's a problem when we're a global church. The fact that most of our legislation done at General Conference is very U.S.-centric and has nothing to do with the work being done in the central conferences. What happens in America doesn't necessarily happen in Africa, and vice versa. Central conferences have long had the ability to take our United Methodist discipline, this document we revise at General Conference, and alter it for context. So there are conferences in Africa that only want to do baptism by immersion, say. Well, they edit and adapt adapt's the word I'm looking for, adapt the discipline to fit those contextual needs. The United States has never been able to do that because the discipline resides with us, right? So as progressives and centrists, you can see that's a problem. It's a vestige of colonialism. It's saying that the U.S. is the norm, which, when you're a global church, there's an issue with that. So regionalization is this movement to make the United States a region, to make the central conferences regions that each have the same exact ability to adapt a general book of discipline to their context. Does that make sense? So that we'd have a general book of discipline that would not be specific to any one region's context. It would be a general book of discipline. We didn't quite get there with this general conference, but one thing at a time. What is the general polity? What are the rules we all want to follow? That would be our general rules. That's called Wesley's general rules. Our social principles, our way of Episcopal leadership and organizing churches and regions and things like that. Those are all, we all do that. But contextual things can be done by the different regions by adapting the discipline. Does that make sense? You with me? So the hope was to pass the regionalization plan. Right, so it wasn't passed before this general conference, but it was passed at general conference. Regionalization involves changing our constitution, which, like America, we have one of those too. Constitutional changes have to be ratified by annual conferences. So each annual conference is presented with these constitutional changes that would support regionalization, and 2/3 of the annual conferences have to ratify. So there's still a step to do, and it's not at this round of annual conferences. Like General Conference just got done a month ago. Most annual conferences are being held now. There's no time, so this will be the next annual, so we have to wait a year before those constitutional changes come to annual conferences, which gives us a year to talk about it and be transparent about it. Okay? Questions about that? Okay. Revising our social principles. We have a document written in 1908 called the Social Principles that has all our, what we feel, what United Methodists feel about things, the principles of the way we do society. Our statements on child labor, on the environment, on reproductive rights, on, those kinds of things, those are all in the Social Principles. The Social Principles, beginning in 1972, contained language that said homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching. We love gay people, but homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching. Every person is created in the image of God, but... and that's what progressives and centrists have been fighting for 52 years, is to get that back out. Alice went in 1976 to try to get it out of there. Over and over and over again, Alice went to try to... So she's a little proud of me that I went on and fixed the church. So it was time. So but we'll get to the removing the harmful language. The revision of the Social Principles also included updated work on environmental issues, stewardship. I wasn't in the social act or the church and society legislative section, so I don't know everything that came there in terms of revising the Social Principles. But removing the harmful language from the discipline, it appeared in the Social Principles and elsewhere in the discipline. So it was sort of a two-prong effect. Several places, not just the incompatibility language, but the language about queer people being clergy, ordination of queer clergy, and marriages in churches, between gay people, GLBTQIA people. All of that, the goal was to remove all of that language from the discipline. Okay, so the 3 R's: regionalization, revising social principles, removing the harmful language. And we did all of it. We did all of it. I know. So one more bit about process. The removing the harmful language and the revising the social principles, those pieces of legislation appeared on consent calendars. In other words, they didn't come for discussion to the floor because the legislative sections had passed those with wide margins. Nobody took them off the consent calendars. Consent calendars are usually 20 or 30 pieces of legislation at a time. You vote on 3 consent calendars every morning. And so when these passed, when the first one passed, it was regionalization. And it was on the consent calendar. Nobody talked about it. We passed the consent calendar, and all the delegations were sitting there like, that just happened? That just happened. Holy cow, that just happened. The same with removing the harmful language from the discipline. Consent calendar items. No discussion. No bashing people on the floor. No speechifying about how awful the other side is. It passed on consent calendars. And we all sat there saying, did that just happen? That just happened. It was so anticlimactic. But the observer section was, of course, erupting in cheers and hooting and hollering and everything because people had been over in the observer section praying and waiting and listening and watching and paying sometimes better attention to what's on the consent calendar than the delegates. So that all happened like that. So that's sort of what happened. Questions? Any thoughts? Questions? Yes, Sarah. What does this mean for what does this mean for, shall we say, defrocked elders? 20 years ago, let me just use one specific example. Thank you for giving me that beautiful segue. Beth Stroud, Eastern Pennsylvania. You may have heard her name. 20 years ago was defrocked for openly being a lesbian United Methodist elder, ordained. She made no bones about it. She lived her truth. She lived herself, and she was defrocked, removed from her position, stripped of her orders. 20 years ago. At the Eastern Pennsylvania Annual Conference, Beth Stroud's orders were restored. We made a way, part of the legislation that went through was a path for restoration of orders to people who had had them taken. And so Beth's orders were restored after 20 years. Yeah, and what's more, there's an incredibly moving photo out there. Part of how they work that is John Scholl, the bishop, knelt in front of her, asking forgiveness on behalf of the bishops who had done this to her. And it just, the hope for queer clergy to have that happen, it's just, that's the ripples. That's the ripples. So there are ways to restore clergy if they want to come back. So many were so badly hurt, they didn't want to come, they didn't want anything to do with us. There are so many queer people who have been pushed out or said not yet or not you so many times that they want nothing to do with us. But Beth stood up and said, I am a United Methodist pastor. I always have been. I always want to be, and came back. So that, I think, is the most meaningful piece out of that for me and for so many. And that picture of her and John Scholl is just weeping material. Yeah. So they can come back if they want to. It was amazing at annual conference how many people who stood up to a microphone this week in Syracuse. We had a cue card to identify yourself because we monitor who's speaking, like male, female, a binary, whatever, race, ethnicity, church you're from. You go through this whole list. And so many stood up and said, I am so-and-so, white, female, lesbian, clergy. And it was just there. It was just there. So, apparently it's going to be a weepy day for me. It means also the marriage piece about being able to have marriages in churches. Church trustees still have the final say. I wish we'd been able to take care of that. Church trustees can say, not in our church, even over the objections of the pastor, who is ultimately supposed to have the say of who they marry. So there's still work to do. But 30 seconds after the legislation passed about both queer clergy and marriages, I got a text from a queer colleague of mine asking me to do their wedding. 30 seconds. I mean, it was just, this is what this General Conference did. There are people who are free to be authentically themselves in the call that God has placed on their lives for ministry and for partnership in the world. So, other questions? Mm-hmm. What percentage of churches have disaffiliated? I don't know the total. Have you paid attention to that? In our conference in Upper New York, 118, which is about 23%. 700. I think it's more than that. I don't know the actual number on that. I know that Western Pennsylvania had half its churches disaffiliate. Half. 495. Southern conferences are decimated.
About 25%.
Total. Yes. We just have had an entire Central Conference disaffiliate. Annual conference disaffiliate. The 𝘾𝙀𝙐𝙃𝙊𝘄𝙃 d'Ivoire with 1 million people disaffiliated following General Conference. They only came in 2008 anyway. Mm-hmm.
There's some distinction between how many churches and how many members.
That is true.
A lot of the churches are small, rural churches.
Right.
So the membership is not the same as some.
Exactly. So it does depend. The number does depend on whether you're talking churches or members. Yeah. What's that? Yes. The disaffiliating churches are 90% white. Tells you something, I think. So a lot, but in the Northeast we haven't been hit as hard. In the Northeast we have a significant but not large number of churches that disaffiliated in the other direction because they weren't going to wait for General Conference to remove the language, and they were tired of living under that discipline. And so really progressive churches that left. Mm-hmm. And General Conference provided a way for a church to come back. Yeah. There are some, yes. Yes. So Roger brings up an interesting movement that is happening, part of this. He points out that in the South Central Texas, Texas and South Central Texas or South Central jurisdiction in Texas, Southeastern jurisdiction in Alabama, Georgia, Florida, many churches, many towns that had multiple United Methodist churches, and all those churches disaffiliated. So what happens to faithful United Methodists who want to stay United Methodist? What's happening is this wonderful growth of new faith communities. These folks are sort of the survivors of these disaffiliations are coming together, and they're forming new and vibrant churches that are growing like crazy because these are folks who've had to keep quiet, mostly because they weren't majority voices in their congregations, and they get to sort of be free. Right. And that's happening in Texas. Roger says if you get 20% of people from each of those disaffiliating churches and you put them together, you're suddenly the largest church in town, even bigger than those disaffiliated congregations that are still there. And so it's just an interesting time. And they're coming up, they have beautiful names of these New Hope churches, and I mean, just beautiful names of these new communities. I know someone in Arizona who's pastoring one of these put together churches and is just blown away. They had 100 people at their first Sunday. Yeah. Of course, they're used to bigger churches down there too, so. Other questions? Can I say something about the spirit of General Conference? Oh, my goodness. Well, I've mentioned, how is it different than my previous experiences at General Conference? Oh, my goodness. Well, I've mentioned that there wasn't as much contention over legislation, right? But there was, and I talked about it some in a sermon when I came back, but just this spirit of kindness and hope and really seeking to discern the path for this sort of new iteration of the United Methodist Church. It was kind, it was gentle, it was excitement, it was just so different. It was not going back to your hotel room every night feeling like you'd been beaten up and assaulted. It was amazing. Totally different than ever. And I've been going for 20 years to General Conference. Mm-hmm.
Is there any feeling that the church will grow, the progressive church, United Methodist, the old United Methodist?
I don't. Ron's asking if we're recording, so this is why I'm repeating the questions. And I'm sorry if there are questions that got through that I didn't repeat before. Sorry. Ron's asking, is there any sense that this new progressive version of the United Methodist Church will grow? I don't know, because while all of this is happening, we're still in a time of mainline denomination decline, in the United States at least. So I don't know. It depends on how these churches live out that new energy. You know, it could be very easy just to sit in your own building and congratulate yourself for being the winners, you know, and not doing anything beyond that. And a lot of churches do that. I don't know. I do not know the answer to that question. I wish I did. I wish I could say absolutely yes, but I don't.
Did the Reconciling Ministries organization have a lot to do with
Did the Reconciling Ministries Network have much to do with this translation? They were part of a coalition of other caucus groups that were providing leadership for legislative section caucus groups. So yes, in that sense. Anybody else? What happens to Reconciling Ministries Network now that we've passed all this? That's a really good question. I'm not sure they even know that answer because the work isn't done. I mean, like I say, trustees still can, right? And we still have pastors out there who want to be United Methodist, want to stay United Methodist, but are not progressive. I mean, they're not fundamentalist, far right, right? But they're not to the point of disaffiliating. So there are folks out there saying, does General Conference mean I have to marry gay people? right? So there's a lot of education and living into this. There's also the reality that churches that are firmly in the center, right? They're big tents. They've got folks of all sorts of thoughts and feelings. They're being targeted in their communities because of the decisions of General Conference in that direction, right? So, and I'm hearing stories of pastors who have people leaving their churches because they're very centrist and they feel like General Conference went too far. So the ripples, I think, are going to continue for a long time, and we just don't know any of the long-term answers. We just don't. It's going to be very interesting to see if we ratify those amendments to regionalize the church. Because we have a year to talk to people about it and teach them what good that is, but there's also a year for people to work on it and say, this is terrible. Anybody else?
I think a lot of the reconciling ministry stuff being turned to repairing relationships.
Sarah's offering, yes, Sarah's offering that maybe the Reconciling Ministry Network work now becomes restoration and healing work, restoring relationships and doing things like overseeing or at least providing help and support for pastors who want to re-enter or churches who want to re-enter. That may be a possible function. Donna? Okay. Donna's asking about the Baltimore-Washington Conference, which is a strong force in our jurisdiction, but also in the United States, because they're a very large conference and a very large delegation. We actually, our delegation actually adopted a man from the Baltimore-Washington. He kept hanging out with us. So we've got an honorary brother in the Baltimore-Washington Conference. Baltimore-Washington has traditionally been more centrist. There are very progressive people in Baltimore-Washington, but there are also not. Last jurisdictional conference, 2 years ago, when we elected our new bishop, there were two openings, there were two people running. One of those candidates was our now bishop. One of them was Jay Williams from New England, who is gay. And Baltimore-Washington hung it up. We ended up only electing one because they didn't want the second vote because they refused to have Jay as a bishop for the jurisdiction. So I would say they're more solidly center than progressive, though they lean left. Does that answer your question? Yeah, sorry. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's your roots. Yeah, Donna's ruminating on her roots in the Baltimore-Washington Conference on the Eastern Shore. And being in a church that in many ways was like Central, but not. Yeah. 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 Other thoughts, questions? That's essentially what happened, and there's still more to come. Constitutional amendments. You know, you go to a party, somebody asks about the constitutional amendments for the United Methodist Church, tell them we need to pass them. Because you'll all be in those spaces, I'm sure. Sarah and Bev will be in that space at annual conference next year, voting on those amendments. We good? Our church did good things this year. and I'm grateful. But thanks for coming and listening. I felt I needed to be able to offer some of that experience and some of what happened. So this is being recorded so we can put it out there for folks. Good, good. Thanks for coming. Have a good afternoon. If someone could help with, we need to close windows and things, if somebody could help with that. Huh?
You want to do 4 back catches before you? I do.